Great, good afternoon. My name is Bradley Flam. I'm the Director of the Office of Sustainability, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this fifth presentation in the Fall 2019 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. This is a series of presentations sponsored by our office, by the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, and Distance Education, which has very kindly been helping us live stream and record these fascinating presentations this semester. If you are generally free on Wednesdays at noon, there are 7 more presentations scheduled through the end of November. I can say that the presentations have been very different, one from the other. We really work hard to get a lot of different topics and fields involved in these presentations, but they have all been fascinating, and you will learn a lot by coming to future presentations. So we encourage you to do so. There are copies of the program on the table here. If you sign up for our email newsletter, which is on the sign-up sheet, you'll get weekly reminders of this and other events that we're involved in. Now, other events we're involved in are quite numerous. I want to just mention a couple of them. Tomorrow evening is going to be the second Spirituality and Sustainability Colloquium at Westchester University. Details are also on a flyer on this table. The title of the talk by Dr. Catherine Keller is Down to Earth: Religion, Gender, and Politics in the Climate Crisis. It promises to be really fascinating. It comes with a great dinner. Starts at 6:30 p.m. Tomorrow downstairs in the Sykes Theater. Later on this semester, we have 2 films. Actually, there are 4 films associated with our environmental film series. The next one is on Thursday, October 17th, about 2 weeks from now. A film called River Blue, looking at the environmental impacts of the fast fashion industry. And then a couple weeks after that, we have our rescheduled showing of a great film called The Biggest Little Farm. It will be on Monday, October 28th, again in Sykes Theater downstairs. So we encourage you to come for all of those events. But now I'd like to introduce Dr. EllieBrown, Professor of Psychology in the College of Sciences and Mathematics here at Westchester University. She has been here at Westchester, I learned, for over a dozen years at this point, doing research through the Early Childhood Cognition and Emotions Lab. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks so much, and thanks for your efforts to organize this and the whole series. I'm really pleased to have a chance to be part of it. Thanks to all of you for coming. I know a number of you are students I know. I appreciate you being here, and a few people I don't know, and I appreciate you coming out also. It's a busy time in the semester, and these are important issues to put attention to, so I appreciate your making the effort to do that. So I'll be talking about the biopsychology of ending poverty, lessons from research on economic instability, household chaos, and child cortisol. And I want to acknowledge, first of all, my grad school mentor, Brian Ackerman, who really shaped my approach to this work. Also my collaborators on one of the research studies I'll talk about, in particular, Kate Anderson, Mallory Garnett, both of whom are alums of our clinical psych master's program here at Westchester, or our psych master's program, not both clinical. And Dr. Erin Hill, who's my colleague in the psych department here and also a collaborator. And the Westchester University research assistants from the Early Childhood Cognition and Emotions Lab, and some of you are here right now, so thank you. All of whom have contributed to this research. Also, Settlement Music School's Kaleidoscope Preschool Arts Enrichment Program, one of our main community partners, and the other Head Start preschools that have collaborated on this. And the children, families, teachers at those programs. Also at Westchester, the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, as well as College of Arts and Sciences, College of Sciences and Mathematics, and the Psych Department have provided support for this work. And the main paper I'll talk about has been published by the Journal of Family Psychology. So the significance of poverty is clear. Worldwide, over 800 million individuals are living in what's called extreme poverty, and that's less than $1.25 per day to live on. So that many of those individuals lack access to resources necessary to meet basic needs like food, clean drinking water, sanitation. Within the United States, nearly 45% of children are growing up in households that are classified as either poor or low income by our federal poverty standards. And in the US, mostly what we're talking about is relative poverty. So most people in this country have enough food to be able to stay alive. They don't necessarily have adequate nutrition, not necessarily able to meet the standards that most of us expect to be able to meet. And the risk associated with growing up in a household classified as poor or low income includes, a host of negative possible developmental outcomes in academic and social, emotional, and physical health domains. So that's one of the reasons that we care about these issues. For me, the significance of poverty has been clear from an early age. I was raised in an upper middle class household, but my mother was raised in poverty, and many of my relatives are still living in poverty. So from the time I was young, I saw the effects of that and saw cousins, other relatives of mine struggling with economic hardship on a daily basis and wanted to make a difference. So the first thing I wanted to do is to take a couple of minutes to get a chance to talk about the significance of poverty for each of us, with recognition that for some of us, there are probably people in this room who have grown up in poverty and have that perspective on these issues, whereas for others, it might be more of an academic topic. It might be a side interest to a broader interest in environmental sustainability. Maybe you've conducted an internship or are conducting research with individuals who are living in conditions of economic hardship. Whatever the significance is for you, I want you to have a minute to talk with a partner about that. So I'm going to ask everyone to find a partner. Designate one person as person A, the other person as person B. Person A will have a minute to talk first about this. I'll tell you when to switch and let person B talk. And when you're not the person talking, your role is really just to listen. You don't have to respond in any way or chime in. So find someone next to you, choose who's A and who's B, and person A can talk first about this. It looks like, can you come over here? Great. Okay, I'm going to ask person A to wrap up and switch and let person B have a turn. Okay, I'll ask person B to wrap up. Welcome. Everyone should feel free to get, cookies, water, coffee at any point. So the UN has identified 17 sustainable development goals, and number one on that list is ending poverty in all its forms everywhere, which says something about the importance of this to creating a sustainable world. The targets include aiming for a world where the poor are not vulnerable to climate change and have equal rights to economic resources. Ending poverty clearly will require structural change. We have institutions in our society that perpetuate poverty and that are designed such that a certain percent of individuals, a certain proportion of individuals in our society will not have sufficient economic resources. So those structures will need to change, and also our culture around these issues will need to change. For example, ending the stigma associated with poverty, and also challenging problematic myths, like the idea that poor people are lazy, quote unquote lazy. If you just work hard enough, you can get out of poverty, right? So myths like that perpetuate problematic perspectives that help to perpetuate poverty. And individuals are part of the institutions and the culture in our society, so it necessarily requires individual change as well. And there's individual change for people facing economic hardship, and some of that is at a biopsychological level, which will be part of the focus of my talk. But also some of the change is for those of us in positions of power and privilege, and being able to shift our frame in terms of how we view poverty, how we view individuals living in poverty, so that we can restructure institutions in the society to not perpetuate economic hardship. So the traditional frame, including for psychological research, but this is a frame that really dominates a lot of how our society thinks about poverty. The traditional frame has cast poverty in terms of social address, and what I mean by that is family income. And the model tends to assume that someone's family income represents something fundamental about them, and that it is sufficient for explaining their life outcomes. It's a deficit model. So when we've used this model to study children facing economic hardship, we have compared children from low-income households to those from middle-income households using middle-class constructs. And when children from low-income households do not score as well, for example, on those constructs, then we conclude they are deficient, right? So it's a deficit model. It's a model of individual blame, blaming children growing up in poverty, for example, for their circumstances and outcomes, or in some cases, blaming their parents. And often we actually see an intersection of classism and sexism in terms of blaming poor mothers for their children's outcomes. Mothers who are assumed not just to be impoverished, but also quote unquote poor mothers, poor parents, and often an intersection with racism as well, as in particular, mothers with Black and brown skin are disproportionately likely to face that blame for difficulties experienced by their children. So there's a need to construct an alternative frame, and my research is part of an effort to do that, and this is research some of you are involved in. So whereas the traditional frame has focused on just income, the alternative frame focuses on a broader poverty ecology. It takes the focus off of an individual and their family income and says, okay, there's a broader system that is functioning to maintain poverty, and we need to look at not just the individual, but their family, their school, their community, the policies and structures that shape conditions for them. And we shift to focusing on diversity among individuals living in poverty, because when we actually look at that broader ecology rather than just income, we realize, okay, individuals living in poverty are actually facing diversity in terms of circumstances, as well as diversity in terms of their life outcomes, and that's actually important to account for. And this model builds an argument for social causation, that it is not the fault of people living in poverty for being in poverty. It is a product of social systems that need to be restructured. So going back to that traditional frame, the social address model focuses on the individual. Low family income or impoverished income is assumed to represent bad genes. And the assumption is that, okay, if you're in poverty, it's because you have a genetic deficit, and that codes for faulty neural pathways that result in poor impulse control, academic failure, conduct problems. According to that model, the only viable treatment becomes eugenics, things like sterilizing young women who are facing economic hardship. And that's something that was talked about very explicitly and openly, for example, in the early 1900s. It is not often talked explicitly about today, but we are not beyond that kind of framework where, I've worked in settings where girls who were in the juvenile justice system were court ordered to have Depo-Provera shots, to have birth control, and that is part of a eugenics frame. And social control. So the idea that the only way to deal with poverty is by controlling people living in poverty rather than actually providing viable structures for people to be have the economic system and resources they need. So when we have a focus on children in poverty, again, we get diversity at the level of persons. We see, oh, no, it's actually, there's a lot of diversity among people living in poverty, there's within group variation, and it's important to focus on a broader poverty ecology. We can't have individuals, so we can't just think about how do we lift this individual in poverty out of poverty. We need to think about restructuring a broader ecology. So we're focused now on the ecology, and then we start to think about, well, what about the ecology of poverty is problematic? And it turns out that what's problematic, again, is not just about income. That's part of the picture, but there's also other contextual risks. So a particular child who's growing up with family income classified as poor or low income might be classified that way because, their parent is in a doctoral program and living on very low economic resources. As a product of that, they might be living in a grandparent's home and really trying to conserve resources, but they actually have a lot of financial cushion to fall back on, for example, by a product of having relatives who have economic resources or that type of thing. That might be very different from a child who has a parent who did not complete high school, who is struggling with mental illness, a child who had to move 5 times in the past year because of a lack of affordable housing, that kind of situation, right? It turns out a child does not experience those factors one at a time. They experience their ecology as a whole, and there are often synergistic effects. So if a child had to move 5 times in the past year, that's hard. And if a child is living in a dangerous neighborhood, that's hard. But it turns out that if a child had to move 5 times in the past year and each time move to a different dangerous neighborhood, well, that's hard in ways that go beyond just adding the impact of those individual factors. It actually has synergistic effects and cumulative effects. It's also important to recognize that in some cases there is equifinality where different combinations of contextual risk factors might lead to the same long-term problems or the same outcomes for children. So we realize that it may not be bad genes that are the cause, that it could be cumulative contextual risk. And then we start to zero in on instability and chaos. So it turns out that it's not just any contextual risk that's problematic. And this is actually in contrast to the idea of equifinality, or the idea that many risks can lead to the same outcome. That is true, but it is also the case that some risks are more problematic in certain ways. That's the idea of specificity. And it turns out that instability and chaos are especially problematic for children. This gets to a process level. So for anyone familiar with Bronfenbrenner's bioecological systems theory, Bronfenbrenner posits that predictable proximal processes power developmental competency. And what that means is that, for example, a child's ability to expect to have predictable, let's say, warm and responsive exchanges with their caregiver is what is going to help them to develop competency. That would be one example of a predictable proximal process. A proximal process would be that immediate interaction the child is having, right? It's important for that to be predictable. If you have instability and chaos, then that can lead to unpredictability in terms of proximal processes. So if a parent is having to work multiple jobs and different shifts, different nights of the week, then their interactions with the child might be less predictable, right? Maybe partly because of just changes in work hours, maybe partly because they're stressed, they're tired, they were up all night, and the child can't expect that stability in terms of the warm and responsive interaction. So when those interactions are not predictable, then it necessarily places a burden on physiological stress response systems, that necessarily that is stressful for any of us. Lack of predictability just does seem to be stressful. And ultimately that has an impact on brain and behavior. So there are two main systems that respond to stress. One is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis. And the activity of this system can be measured by way of its end products, which are glucocorticoids. The primary glucocorticoid is the stress hormone cortisol. And cortisol can be measured non-invasively. So through saliva samples, we don't have to test a child's blood, for example. We can just put a Q-tip type swab like this in their mouth for a minute, they suck on it, then we put it in a tube for later analysis. Cortisol serves our daily functioning. It helps us with learning and memory and metabolism and immune support. And it follows a diurnal pattern, a pattern across the day where the highest levels are in the morning. So if you ever find yourself like craving carbohydrates, you want that bagel in the morning, that might be because that's when your cortisol levels are highest, and having high cortisol actually motivates us to search for carbs as well as novel experiences for learning first thing in the morning. And it has a steep decline kind of to mid-morning, and then a more gradual decline across the remainder of the day, reaching its lowest level just before bedtime. If we experience a stressful situation, there's a rise in cortisol that's superimposed on that baseline level. So it's kind of added, a rise in cortisol added to what the level would typically be at that time of day. And that rise in cortisol would be to help us mobilize physiological resources to respond to stress. That's adaptive, that we need to be able to do that. And yet, if we experience repeated or chronic stress as what might be typical in poverty environments, then we can have chronically elevated cortisol levels. So, that lighter aqua line represents what might become an elevated cortisol level that might become established in response to experiencing so many stressors that then your body is kind of hyperactive. It's called hypercortisolism. So you're hyper responsive to stress. That ends up posing problems. It turns out that if individuals are exposed to acute trauma or chronic stress over a long period, then that elevation might actually become desensitization. So eventually you might just kind of bottom out. Your body can't keep mobilizing resources to that extent, and you might end up with flattened or depressed cortisol levels known as hypocortisolism. Either of those variations are problematic. If you have too much cortisol, the elevation, then it can flood brain areas involved in learning and memory and self-regulation. If you're just experiencing a single stressful situation, then there would just be short-term impairment. But if you're experiencing repeated chronic elevation in cortisol, then not only is it interfering with the functioning of certain brain areas that are rich in receptors for cortisol, but it's actually influencing the development of those brain areas. So for example, the prefrontal cortex is involved in a lot of self-regulatory activities. It's also really rich in receptors for cortisol. So if you have elevated cortisol, it will impair functioning in that area, and it will also lead to change over time in neural circuitry in that area, actually influencing development. And what's more, cortisol can stimulate change at the level of the cell nucleus, so it can actually influence gene expression, so that your genetic expression might be different over time. What parts of your genes get expressed might be different as a product of having higher levels of cortisol. Meanwhile, if you have those flattened levels, then you don't have the necessary physiological resources for learning, memory, immune support, those kinds of things. So that is problematic as well. So when we start to study the HPA axis and cortisol, we also see diversity, not just in terms of persons and context, but across time. We see that systems that are adaptive can actually lead to problematic outcomes over time as a product of cumulative contextual risk, environmental adversity. So it's not a matter of children growing up in poverty have poor genes that lead to problems in self-regulation. Actually, they have genes just like all of us do that lead to healthy responses to stress, but it's a matter of if you're experiencing stress too much of the time, if you're experiencing that kind of environmental adversity, then it can become problematic for your brain functioning and behavior over time. High allostatic load represents the tax on physiological systems that respond to stress. So not only would elevated cortisol levels change the functioning of those particular brain areas that are rich in receptors for cortisol, but it would also change the functioning of those stress response systems, which has implications for stress response over time as well as for physical health functioning, and could be associated with things like hypertension and high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes, and physical health, poor immune functioning over time. And with this, we see that there's an experiential canalization of development. So this is a model proposed by key researchers in this area, Blair and Raver, basically showing that environmental adversity can lead to a number of things. First of all, it can diminish the quality of caregiving or parenting, but it can also directly influence stress hormones for children, which can in turn influence expression of genes and neural connectivity, and then self-regulation being things like, on an emotional level, being able to regulate emotions and behavior in the service of learning, pro-social interaction. So when we start to flesh out this model, we begin to see that it's not just bad genes coding for faulty neural pathways, but instead cumulative environmental risk, eventually leading to unpredictable proximal processes, high allostatic load, and experiential canalization. The symptoms, the problems are pretty similar in both models, but framed a little bit differently in the alternative model in terms of self-regulatory difficulties, cognitive and social emotional problems. There continue to be some gaps in our understanding. So these are, this is the proposed alternative model. And there is some good evidence to back up parts of the model. So Sonia Lupin and colleagues demonstrated in 2001 that poverty indeed, quote unquote, gets under the skin and influences these stress response systems. And there have been a number of other studies that have established that, but it is still an emergent research area. And there are few studies on the whole that examine the relation between poverty and HPA functioning, particularly for young children. We know there are limitations of family investment models. So family investment models would say, well, it's all about income and the material resources that income can purchase. That's what matters for children. We know that's limited, because we know it is important to account for these other risks that children might face, dangerous neighborhoods, inadequate school systems, problems within the family, and yet few studies include a robust account of contextual risk. Furthermore, it's theorized that there's this unique importance of instability and chaos. So we say, oh, those are the most important things because it's stressful for children if things aren't predictable. And yet few studies have actually isolated those variables and looked at instability and chaos separate from other aspects of hardship, or examined economic instability specifically in relation to cortisol. We don't know of any studies before the one I'll tell you about that have examined economic instability in relation to cortisol, nor do we know of any studies examining chaotic living conditions as a family process variable in relation to young children's cortisol. And so what I mean by chaotic living conditions is our hypothesis going into the present study was the idea that, well, first of all, that income, so that family investment models are limited. So income may or may not predict children's cortisol levels if we're looking at children who are all facing economic hardship. Because, if you think about if a family has, let's say, $6,000 per year to live on versus $7,000 per year, is that difference gonna matter as much as whether the family had to change homes 10 times in the past year? Probably not. Probably that instability variable of having to move 10 times in the past year because of lack of access to affordable housing actually matters more for how that child is doing than that increment in income. And we think economic instability is actually going to be particularly important, even more so than other aspects of economic hardship, because of how it interferes with children being able to expect predictability. We also think that it's going to create kind of chaotic living conditions at the family level. So if a parent has to change grocery shopping habits, transportation routines, then that's not only going to influence like that parent, but also the child's plans and routines, and could be inherently stressful for that child. So for the study that I'm focusing on, there were 374 children, their caregivers. These were children attending a Head Start preschool program in Philadelphia. About half were identified by their parents as being female. About half African American, 15% Latino Hispanic American, about 10% Asian American, and about 20% Caucasian or European American. Preschool children tend to be 3 to 5 years old. The average age for these children was 4 years old, and nearly all of them, more than 98%, were living in households classified as poor or low income. So they were almost all facing economic hardship. Ethical standards were followed. The study was approved by the Westchester IRB. We recruited families at the time of their preschool enrollment, and parents completed 3 different interviews with a trained Westchester University research assistant. So one was demographics, things like family income, how many people live in your home, and those factors are actually combined to create a family income to needs ratio, which is then compared to the federal poverty guidelines. Also an economic events questionnaire. So this questionnaire is pretty common in psychological research. It comes from what's known as the family stress model, and it looks at 3 aspects of economic hardship. One is material hardship, questions like how hard is it for your family to have the food that you need, have the housing that you need, the clothing that you need, those kinds of things. The second subscale looks at financial strain. So how difficult was it to pay bills, for example? Parents rate statements like, our income never seems to catch up with our expenses, and they say how true that was for them. And the third subscale measures instability. So again, things like we had to change our grocery shopping habits to be able to make ends meet, or we had to change our transportation routines to be able to make ends meet. And that was the part we were most interested in. And then they also filled out we filled out with them a chaos scale. The chaos stands for chaos, hubbub, and order. It's the most common measure of household chaos, and it includes items like whatever our family plans are, they never seem to work out. It's hard to hear yourself think in our house. Let's see, things like our home is disorganized, we don't have stable routines, those kinds of things. And that was what we thought, okay, at a process level, if you're experiencing economic instability, then those kinds of daily family processes are likely to be compromised. And then children provided those saliva samples of cortisol. So again, we put those swabs in the kid's mouth for a minute, and put it in a tube for later analysis. We did that on 2 different days, and we did it at 9 a.m., just after they arrived at preschool. So that would be not that highest waking up point, but it would be kind of, while it's still pretty high, probably higher than it's going to be the rest of the day. And that's considered a pretty good overall indicator of cortisol functioning. And we looked at the relations among these variables. So we were interested in, does economic instability predict children's stress levels, and does household chaos help to explain that impact? We looked at zero order correlations, and also we used structural equation modeling. Anyone here really interested in the statistics? Raise your hand if you are, because I will talk a little bit. Okay, a little bit. Okay, so structural equation modeling is this really cool program that allows us to do a couple of neat things. One thing is to look at latent variables, and that would be a variable that we assume exists in the context of what we're measuring, but we don't measure it directly. So for example, we assume we're tapping child cortisol, child stress levels, but really what we have are these 2 individual times where we looked at children's cortisol. Well, we can basically use this program, this type of modeling, to see how those 2 individual measures of child cortisol are related and might represent the presumed variable of children's overall cortisol functioning. Similarly, when we're looking at economic adversity, so there were those 3 subscales I told you about, like material hardship, financial strain, economic instability. We can see the relation among those and how they might represent a broader construct of economic adversity that we did not actually measure, but that those are supposed to combine to represent. The other thing structural equation modeling allows us to do is look at path models, so linking one variable to another to another. So I'll show you the model we came up with, and a lot of these bubbles actually represent error, things that we assumed we were not fully measuring. So I'll show you a version without that, because that's not really the most important part, and then it's a little easier to make sense of. So in this model, again, we did not have a single measure that just tapped economic adversity. Actually, what we had is 3 subscales: material hardship, financial strain, economic instability. But it turned out those were all related and all seemed to tap a common factor of adversity. Similarly, over here, so we had those 2 different measures of child cortisol that were highly related and seemed to tap a latent construct of child cortisol. And then when we look at the pathways, income poverty does not share a significant relationship with child cortisol, again, within a sample where everyone's facing economic hardship. So it's not a matter of, is economic hardship stressful? It is. It's a matter of, does some small increment in income, if you're already facing hardship, matter most, or is it other things that matter most, like instability? So income predicted economic adversity, and indirectly, therefore, predicted material hardship, financial strain, economic instability, and chaos. Meanwhile, economic instability was the only one of these adversity factors that related directly to child cortisol. So that was uniquely powerful. It was more important than material hardship or financial strain, again, within this economically disadvantaged sample for predicting children's stress levels, and chaotic living conditions in the home, again, disruptions to plans, routines, kind of chaos, hubbub, and disorder in the home that would be created by circumstances of adversity predicted child cortisol. So I'll go over these relations here. So the summary is, so income predicted economic adversity, and indirectly, therefore, predicted instability, strain, hardship, and family chaos. Economic adversity predicted economic instability, and indirectly, through economic instability, predicted child cortisol. Economic adversity also predicted chaotic living conditions, so a family experiencing greater adversity also had greater chaos at home, and that predicted child cortisol. If we break down economic adversity, it is the economic instability aspect that is the only aspect that directly relates to children's cortisol. So that seems to be the most problematic aspect here, and the impact is partly explained by the role of economic instability in creating chaotic household living conditions, which then in turn relates to higher stress levels for children. Any questions about that before I move on, just because these are the kind of details that, yeah. Yeah, so these are, so this is all quantitative and they were continuous measures, so, yep. Yes. And here we're talking about inferential statistics based on that. So basically the structural equation modeling is mostly, it's based on regression frameworks, yeah. Mm-hmm. So one of the key things here is we're not comparing these children to children who are living in a middle income home, and that's on purpose. So we assume that on the whole, if we looked at average stress levels for this group, it would be heightened stress compared to children living in middle income homes. But what's important to us here is, well, is there variation that can allow us to draw inferences about what aspects of poverty are particularly problematic and particularly should be targeted for intervention in order to break cycles of poverty? And so the hypothesis was that instability and chaos are particularly problematic. Higher, yep. And we have, so we've done some analyses where we've tried to look, well, is there a subgroup that shows that flattened low level? And yeah, we do have a subgroup, but it's like 6 children. So again, those are probably children who have, well, and we do have measures we've tried to look at. Those tend to be children who have faced either many of these risks, like 6 different risk factors all combined, or a particular trauma above and beyond just run-of-the-mill economic hardship. Yeah. So, you know, the study is limited. It's a single study. We use this kind of snapshot representation of instability. And that's odd, right? Because we're talking about instability, which necessarily implies change over time. And yet we measured it at just a single time. And we asked parents to report about it, which is limited. It would be better if we kind of had our own objective measure of what was this family's financial circumstances in September, and then what was it in January, and what was it in June, and did that matter for the child's progress over the course of the year? We didn't have that in this case. Morning cortisol also is limited because we know it's just one indicator of that diurnal trajectory, and we do have other studies where we have additional indicators, and what we see when we really look at the additional indicators is kind of important to be looking at that whole picture, because you see different things when you look at different pieces of the trajectory. The present sample is very specific, so it's preschool age children. Early childhood is important because that is when there's a lot of development of those brain areas that are involved in learning, memory, self-regulation that we think cortisol has a big impact on. But all the same, it doesn't mean that these results would be the same for children of a different age or for children who were middle income, for example. But we still think there are important implications of the work. So one is that income is necessary to account for, but not sufficient. right? So income does create situations of economic adversity, but if you really want to understand how to disrupt a cycle of poverty, you can't just focus on income. You have to be accounting for other variables, including instability. That instability does hold particular importance, and that there's a role of family level chaos. So often if we do in psych research, if we do account for more than just income, often it's a parenting variable. And again, that can kind of reinforce models that say, well, parents in poverty are quote unquote poor parents. They are to blame for children's outcomes. And this is a little different because by looking at family level chaos, we would be assuming economic instability is creating chaotic family living conditions that would then influence children directly, as well as influencing parenting processes. And neither parents nor children are to blame for that. It's kind of a product of the economic hardship and instability that's experienced. So our hope is that by identifying those factors, it can help with deconstructing the moral model, the model that says poor people are to blame for quote unquote poor outcomes. And again, the kind of intersections of classism, sexism, and racism that come along with that model. The present study really shows diversity in terms of persons. So it does show, okay, even among children facing economic hardship, there are differences in stress functioning, for example, in terms of contexts, that what types of economic adversity you're facing matter, in terms of proximal processes, so again, family level chaos mattering, and in terms of time. Again, that idea that, well, it's adaptive for children to have an elevation in cortisol in response to stress. It's when they're having to respond to stress all the time that then becomes problematic. And the hope is that makes an argument for social causation and suggests that there is possibility for intervention. Right, so whereas that traditional frame, that social address model gives us the only viable treatment options are eugenics or social control, the alternative frame suggests that there are viable alternatives for intervention. There have been studies on poverty alleviation programs that have demonstrated that when you do lift economic resources, children's stress levels go down. So that's important. And our study is suggesting that there's an importance of stability, both in terms of access to economic resources and also in terms of microsystem processes, like at the family level, being able to have predictability in family routines, for example. We've done some work in our lab that's been about stress reduction. And the idea would be that even though we have to restructure broad systems to give all families access to adequate economic resources, there's also an importance of reducing stress levels for children currently facing economic hardship to promote their positive development and opportunity to be able to reach their optimal potential. And we have shown, for example, that certain preschool interventions, like high quality arts programs where children can use dance, music, visual arts, mindfulness, and yoga to be able to kind of regulate, express emotions, learn how to manage emotions, can influence not just cortisol in the moment, but can influence those trajectories over the course of the day. So there's reason for hope there. Early childhood is an important time to intervene, again, because that is when many brain areas involved in learning, memory, self-regulation are developing. So my conclusion would be that that ending poverty is about more than money. Of course, it is also all about money. So, this work has shown that income is insufficient as a predictor. The traditional frame would say, well, we just need to measure family income. That represents something about a child's genetics, and that's all we need to know. The traditional frame says, no, this isn't about an individual's income and their genetics. It's about a broader poverty ecology at play. But of course, it is income poverty that sets the context for other aspects of adversity. And if if those other aspects of adversity, like instability and chaos, can get under the skin and influence eventually brain functioning and behavior, and if there's a possibility of alleviating the impact of poverty and intervening successfully, then that suggests that poverty is not inevitable and that there are viable options for ending poverty, creating a world in which no child has to grow up in poverty. That requires not only a change for those children and for individuals facing economic hardship, but again, also a change for us in terms of our frame for approaching poverty. So I guess, what I would say is that we tend to, I think there's probably no one in this room who would completely buy that traditional frame and say, well, I think if someone is poor, then they have quote unquote poor genes and that's what explains it all. At the same time, many of us would like to hold on to some belief in meritocracy, right? To some belief in that American dream, the idea that, well, but if you work harder, you can get ahead. Well, something about the power and privilege I have is because I deserve it, right? Something about individuals living in poverty means they deserve those circumstances a little more than I do. And I would challenge us, to keep pushing up against that and to consider abandoning that kind of frame altogether and think what would be different about our mindset and our approach to these issues if we gave up those ideas altogether.